Hello, welcome everyone. Nice to see you all here and welcome to the Tech23 Impact Circles. It's wonderful to have you all join us for what's sure to be a great conversation exploring towards identity equity, building an equitable and inclusive identity ecosystem. As is custom, I would like to first acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slatterys team meets, works and creates. We pay our respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging. And we also acknowledge that people are attending today from different traditional lands and nations and extend our respects to their custodians, ancestors, elders and future leaders. Always was, always will be. Hello, Rachel.
Hello, Adina, and it's lovely to see everyone joining us today for what promises to be a wonderful conversation about identity equity. I especially want to welcome our contributors today, Ellie, Mardi, Amelia, Katy, who are in the capable hands of Amanda. And I want to welcome everyone who is Zooming in. One of the best things about Zoom is its ability for us to reach around the country and into people's homes. So please say hello on the chat, tell us where you are, and maybe even just a little bit about why you're interested or what your stakeholder relationship is to this wonderful conversation. Tech23 is all about amplifying the people and the organisations that are chipping away at the big challenges we face. And coming to you any which way, Tech23 this year, for the 12th year, is going to also be celebrating Australian innovation by spotlighting 23 companies. So stay tuned, we'll be announcing those soon, the 23 innovators from around the country. We also have a real person lunch for those lucky enough to be in Sydney in December with the amazing Mike Walsh. So check out the website for those. And we have a lot more circles planned, including some of the recordings for the ones that have already happened. So if you're interested in space, ag tech, cyber, robots, there's lots of circles coming up that you might want to also join. None of this could be possible without the support of our sponsors. So I just want to call them out. We've got Oz Industry, UNSW, Main Sequence with CSIRO, New South Wales Government, Macquarie University, Addison's, Anstow and Cicada Innovations. Thank you all so much for making these circle conversations possible. Again, I want to welcome everyone and just reiterate that this is a very relaxed and welcoming atmosphere, and we're trying to create, I suppose, an area where everyone feels safe to contribute. After we've eavesdropped on the conversation of the wonderful contributors, we'll then have the opportunity to meet people and connect in what are small discussion groups. So enjoy the circle, and I'm handing back to Adina for some more housekeeping.
Thank you, Rachel. Always a struggle for the mute button. Thank you for that. Yes, we do have a couple of reminders, won't be long. So you would have seen in your reminder email and in the Zoom chat, there is a link to the Slatterys Community Charter, a good read if you need guidance on the behaviour that's encouraged at the circles. Just to confirm the running order today, as Rachel mentioned, we'll be starting with Amanda and the other contributors, kicking off the conversation, followed by audience Q&A, and then we'll finish with a randomised deep dive breakout rooms. Now, we are using a shared mural board, which is going to be a visual artifact for people to capture your thoughts, any squiggles. So please feel free to add whatever you like to that. As Rachel mentioned, please add any questions to the chat function in Zoom or put up your hand if you'd like to ask something live. Now, we will be recording this presentation and we'll make it available post-event so you can revisit. As Rachel mentioned, we'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of the Circle contributors and all the Tech23 sponsors and supporters for helping today's session come into being. We also want to thank all of you for dialing in and joining us. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Amanda to kick things off. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Adina. So welcome everyone to our discussion on identity equity and why in our digitally enmeshed world, having access to a trusted and verifiable digital identity is essential to human dignity. I'm Amanda Robinson. I'm Head of Social Innovation and Humanitech at Australian Red Cross. And I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks to help set the context for our discussion, and then invite our contributors to share their own experiences and insights, as well as some of the opportunities and challenges that they have encountered in developing a fair and equitable identity ecosystem. I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to such an inspiring group of industry leaders working across government, academia, and the for-purpose sectors to kick off our conversation today. And as a conversation, please do feel free to ask questions or post them in the chat function as we go along, and we'll make sure we've got plenty of opportunity to address those at the end. So first of all, some brief introductions. I'd like to introduce Amelia Crook. Amelia is Head of Product at Traverse, which is a digital credentialing tool that Australian Red Cross is developing in order to enable greater civic, social and economic participation for all. Amelia has spent the last 20 years building products at leading digital companies, including Seek, Amazon and Lonely Planet, as well as several successful startups. We also have with us today Mardi Hall, who is Director of Supported Identity and Transformation at Services Australia. As part of the agency's identity program, Mardi's team works collaboratively with the Department of Home Affairs, trialling the use of face matching services in a welfare context. And this includes research on how Services Australia can support vulnerable and under-identified customers prove who they are. I'm also delighted to introduce Professor Ellie Rennie. Ellie is an ARC Future Fellow and Principal Research Fellow at RMIT's Digital Ethnography Research Centre. She's also a member of the RMIT's Blockchain Innovation Hub and an Associate Investigator at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. And last but certainly not least, as Manager of the Trust Alliance for Australian Red Cross, Katy Southall leads a network that brings together private, public and for-purpose organisations to develop and use shared standards and design principles for the ethical digital identity. This follows a 25-year career in international development across Asia Pacific, Central Africa, UK and Europe. And as a consultant, Katy has worked with impact-driven investors and startups. So it's a great thrill to be joined by all of these great contributors here today for this conversation. So to set a bit of context, in the world today, more than 1.1 billion people have no official proof of identity, which prevents them from accessing vital services, protections and rights such as voting, healthcare, social services, education and finance. A further 3.2 billion people around the world have some form of identification, but are unable to use it in digital channels, which greatly diminishes their ability to fully engage in a society where digital tools and platforms are becoming ubiquitous in both our public and private lives. So technologies such as blockchain and biometrics are paving the way for the creation of a verifiable, secure and portable digital identity, which is hugely exciting, but also opens up the possibility of abuse and misuse. In response to these, there are organisations like Media Network, the World Economic Forum and ID 2020 have made significant contributions towards raising awareness of the importance of a good digital identity that is based on privacy and inclusion, as well as user value and control. But in order for digital identity to be really useful, we need to set the right conditions. We need to address the fundamental imbalances of power, and we need to rethink our Western notion of identity. We need equitable systems that drive adoption and create pathways for all people, enabling fair and equal access. If we get this wrong, not only do we risk compromising our safety and privacy, but we risk further marginalisation and harm to people who are experiencing vulnerability and the aggravation of existing social injustices. The design and development of an equitable identity ecosystem, therefore, requires a humanity-first approach. Humanity first goes beyond human-centred design to ensure people are not only at the core, but in control of technologies. Designing with a humanity-first approach, however, is certainly not without its challenges, and we'll hear more about that when we speak to Amelia and Katy in particular. But first, I would like to invite Mardi to please tell us about some of the challenges that Services Australia encounter in supporting people with no recognised or limited form of identity. Mardi, may I hand over to you to give us some of your experiences, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak at today's forum. As Amanda introduced, my name's Mardi Hall. So I'm the Director in Services Australia Identity Program. So by means of quick introduction, Services Australia, as you may be aware, our reach extends to the majority of Australians through our three major portfolios of Centrelink, Medicare and child support. In Services Australia, we have a responsibility not only to support Australians to access payments and services, but to protect their personal and sensitive information. And one of the ways that we do this is by ensuring that we are helping the right person through a robust identity enrolment. In Services Australia, a typical identity enrolment or confirmation usually requires a person to produce three forms of identity documentation, that being a commencement document to prove that they were born in Australia or they have arrived here, proof of use in community, which typically would be through some form of photo identification, and then a secondary use in the community. So further evidence that they are operating that identity within the community, such as utility bills, etc. So how does lack of identity manifest in the community? For most people, the process that I just explained is relatively easy to produce. There are, however, a number of vulnerable customers who simply just cannot meet that standard of identity requirements, as we're probably all aware, and will never be able to without our support. So to talk about some specific examples of people that do struggle to prove their identity, people with unregistered births or no birth certificate. Indigenous people commonly fall into this category from remote communities. Homeless people, including youth that do not have access to parent or guardian consent to be able to access their documents. People fleeing domestic violence is another situation in which identity is a struggle. People have had their documents withheld from them, or they're unable to return to the home where they store those documents. People who are temporarily or permanently incapacitated and they can't come into our Centrelink office. So at present, identity, with the exception of COVID, our identity processes do require a face-to-face interaction. And for people experiencing mobility issues, that's a real struggle for them sometimes. People exiting the justice system often do not have the sufficient identity documents, dependent on the time or other circumstances of which they've been in jail. Elderly people or children that don't have a verifiable photo ID. A lot of our elderly customers don't have a need to have photo ID anymore. They may not drive, they may not travel. For the people who do not have a verifiable immigration document, for some refugees or people who arrived from overseas on the assisted migration scheme, known as the £10 POMs commonly in our agency, real struggle for them to prove their commencement that they arrived. So this list is by no means an extensive list, and each individual circumstances are certainly unique. Now, as a welfare agency, our priority is about getting support for those in needs as our utmost priority. So we do have alternative identity provisions in place to support these customers, just to ensure that they'll always be able to access payments and services. Our alternative identity provisions do include regular reviews for some of these customer groups, and this was originally designed to give us the opportunity to confirm when a customer's circumstances change. However, it does see them some customers fall into a perpetual review cycle where they will never actually be able to confirm who they are. So we want to be able to support those customers and ensure that once they leave our offices, that they're no longer remaining disadvantaged within the community. So the problem doesn't stop once they leave our door. They go to interact, to open a bank account, apply for a house, etc., and they still have the same issues. So what might the alternative identity look like? We definitely are very passionate about resolving the issues for this cohort. We're in the early stages of exploring alternative pathways to a higher level of confidence in a person's identity, to remove, where possible, the need for this perpetual review cycle I spoke of, and provide a solution for people to use the identity that we are able to develop into the wider community. So initially, what we're looking to do to achieve this, within our agency, within Service Australia and at government, we are fortunate to have access to a large range of data. Now, initially, we would like to explore how we can better use that data, and then further the relationships that we have within our own agency. A common misconception, I guess, out in the community is that government all share their information, and unfortunately that's just not the case. A good example of that is within our own agency, between our Centrelink and Medicare programs. We do have very strict provisions around information sharing between those two portfolios. But it is a common perception out there that we do all share that data. We want to be able to improve what actually goes on behind the scenes and make sure that it is, we're accessing it for the right reasons for starters, but we can also better use it to support people without having to cause them the drama of or the barriers that they're facing for identity specifically. Within the agency, we have a number of specialists. We'd like to engage with them a little bit more to understand how they might be able to provide more autonomously some information to us to build confidence in a person's identity. So roles such as our multicultural service officers, social workers who see a large portion of that cohort that I just explained earlier, and our Indigenous service officers, we're starting some more thorough engagement with them to understand what they have access to and perhaps how they can help the identity profiling journey. So the other thing we'd like to do is using forums such as this and some other avenues that we're following is strengthening existing relationships or creating new community links. So the concept behind that is on a referee basis. We currently have a similar process for our Indigenous communities where we have our elders who are able to verify or act as a referee to confirm confidence in a person's identity. We'd like to extend that more broadly out to other community contacts that we have to be able to build and assist that confidence level of who that person is. We're in a fairly unique position here within government too, to use the experiences, the contacts we have to influence our national identity standards. So where possible through our government relationships, we are feeding back the challenges that are being faced by our more vulnerable customers, improving who they are, sharing our experiences with agencies such as the Digital Transformation Agency, who are leading the way in the digital economy changes for government, which certainly highlights a key part that was raised earlier in the introductions was, I guess, the pace at which COVID has pushed us into the digital economy. And for this customer group in particular, they struggle as it is to produce their identity documents in a face-to-face context. So we're actually in the digital world making that challenge, that barrier even bigger. We want to make sure that through using technology, through using data, relationships, that we can ensure that those customers aren't left behind in the digital journey. So part of my role, and it is separate to this piece of work around looking at identity profiling, is testing out some technology through the Department of Home Affairs face matching services. Now, that existing service relies on you to already have a credential, but we are going to consider ways through facial biometric technology to see how we can possibly enrol using all the information that we've built on the person, enrolling them into some form of biometric database to allow them to then be able to interact in that channel should they wish to do so. And that's probably the biggest, the most important message that we want to stress here, is that this is a channel for those that would like to get into the digital channel, not necessarily being pushed into that world. But it's not to discount the fact that the technology can certainly help us get them there if that's what they want to do. So we've got a long road ahead of us in terms of, you know, increasing the data exchange that we already have, using technology to improve how we use the information we have within our Services Australia databases, and then further strengthening the community relationships to help these customers be able to confidently engage in society and not have identity as a barrier for them. There is as part of our work, we'd also like to, we will be conducting some user research with some existing customers initially, and then reach out further to the community around the need to have a physical credential. Now, this particular, that needs to be approached very sensitively, of course, but ultimately our focus is about, let's solve the issue of building an identity profile to a level of confidence that can be accepted beyond our payments and services and out into the community. So hopefully we get there. I think with groups such as this and listening to everybody else's experiences, that is just helping us create the big picture even more so, and hopefully we'll be you know, on the pathway to solve the gaps for most of this cohort.
Thank you, Mardi. Some really fascinating insights there, and I think particularly around the work that you're doing and involving people who are sort of at the front line or with lived experience, but it's certainly in ensuring that sort of everybody is brought along, particularly in the light of COVID-19, and as we said, the sort of acceleration of digital technologies, sometimes with some you know, untoward implications if we don't do it carefully. We'll hopefully have time to come back to some of those points in the discussion, but I would love to now bring Ellie into the conversation. Ellie, you've worked as a digital ethnographer on the topic of digital inclusion, particularly in relation to remote Australia and Indigenous communities. Recently, you've been working on a paper on digital trust in relation to data governance. There's so much there as well to talk about. I was wondering, can you talk to us a bit about the concept of trust and in whom and where we placed our trust, whether that be a person or an institution, and how does blockchain technologies disrupt our idea of trust?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amanda. As the academic here, I'm going to use that to lean in and start with a quote from a philosopher, which is Honora O'Neill. And she wrote once that deception is the enemy of trust, not secrecy, which I think is really interesting concept. And I want to come back to that because when we look at trust in relation to secrecy, the response is to call for more transparency and accountability, which of course just heightens the kind of audit society dynamics and the pressure on us, and indeed probably increases mistrust within our culture. And I want to come back to that in relation to blockchain, but first maybe to step back and think about what digital trust itself is in general. When we talk about digital trust, the way that information and particularly internet enabled information sharing works, we're mostly talking about trust either in corporations or in government agencies indeed, and how they use our data and what they do with it. So we tend to think about public trust that we put in corporations, and we're trusting them. We're trusting them to care for how they use our data and protect our privacy and the like, mostly because they have a risk to their reputation if they fail to do that. So it all comes back to this kind of idea of corporate social responsibility or a social license around use of data. However, I think that trust is really not that straightforward, particularly digital trust, because, for instance, we've seen situations where, you know, the Commonwealth Bank was emailing customers and telling them that they shouldn't be trusting startups who are using screen scraping technologies for things like, you know, investment apps or neobank style businesses. in fact, Commonwealth Bank and all the banks use screen scraping behind the scenes within their organisations anyway. They operate under the same regulations and the rest of it. And in fact, when the Commonwealth Bank was doing that, they were being brought before a prudential inquiry and being found to have very poor governance in relation to non-financial risks. Whereas, you know, the startups that they were warning people about really hadn't had any major breaches or problems, and in fact had very good, and probably had very good digital hygiene when it came to use of people's data and privacy. So it is this question of who do we trust and why? And of course, you know, we're going to trust something with 150 years corporate experience over something that we've never heard of before, some kind of new startup. So what I think the dynamics there that are coming through is that digital trust it's a competitive playing field between different companies and agencies. And in fact, as users and customers, we really don't know where we stand. And there's a number of reasons for that. We don't always have a choice in what services we're using when we're using the internet. You know, what we're trying to buy might only be available in one site, or, you know, a particular government agency might be the provider of that service and no one else. I think in addition, you know, technological enabled privacy is not something that's easy to get your head around. You can't go through and audit the code of a particular website or application every time you want to agree to a terms of service. And those terms of service, of course, are often highly complicated, full of legalese and the like. So look, I think that essentially the way that the systems are built mean that we have to think about these issues in relation to digital trust, which is an insufficient concept. So this is where I think blockchain becomes interesting and useful, because what it's doing is it's using these mechanisms such as cryptography, economic incentives and the like. It's essentially machines performing actions that don't rely on a trusted intermediary for that to occur. So what does that mean in relation to identity and the particular topic that we have to hand here? I think, for instance, with applications like Traverse, which we're about to hear more about, you don't necessarily need to trust that the paper copy of the credential or the driver's license or whatever it is that you have is valid and not fraudulent, because the application in the case of Traverse is conducting an attestation with the original provider of that particular credential, the issuer. So it's taking some of those unknowns and I suppose some of the doubts away. So in fact, what it's doing is it's a form of trustlessness, or overcoming the need for trust, that is important here. So if you go back to the Honora O'Neill quote, it's eliminating the ability to deceive. It's not about transparency, it's about just eliminating the ability of companies to, or individuals to deceive in this instance. And we don't need more monitoring necessarily in order to be able to achieve that. The outcome of all of that, which is what I'm most interested in, what I find particularly fascinating, is that it makes cooperation and coordination easier between organisations as a result. And I think we'll hear more about how the Trust Alliance, which I've had the privilege of being involved with for the last 6 months, how it's managing to do that. I think just on a final note, I think it's also worth pointing out that these are socio-technical systems. Although the technology might have this degree of trustlessness, it doesn't mean that there are not other points within the system which do rely on trust, or where there could be a concentration of resources or power that could potentially undermine that. This is why we need social research into these technologies, not just engineering and computer science. It's not just a mathematical answer, and it never will be. However, by, I think, reducing that need for a monitoring society, the monitory democracy, we can hopefully achieve better cooperation where it's most needed. I'll come back to the digital inclusion questions later, I think, Amanda.
Great, thanks, Ellie. That's great setting the scene as well, and certainly points to some of the the challenges that Mardi raised around trust and trust in government and where that sort of data resides. So I think it's one of those interesting challenges that needs to be overcome in order for us to get real adoption and utility of digital identity and digital identity credentials. Amelia, would love to bring you into the conversation now, because you have had real life experience in building a digital credentialing product and using blockchain technology to develop a way of proving people's trustworthiness and reputation, I guess, in essence. But again, not without its challenges, particularly when you're trying to cope with humanity first, self-sovereign identity, but also taking a commercial product to market. Could you tell us how can verifiable digitals help enable digital identity, maybe as a starting point?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. So I joined Red Cross to build a startup, which is not a normal sentence for people to make, but here I am. And we're building Traverse, which is a digital credentialing tool. And we have a vision that we can somehow help build a bridge to equal civil, social and economic participation for all. And I'll go into what that means, but I think it'd be useful to quickly define what a credential is. So from a technology perspective, it's a bundle of 4 things: identity, so who is this credential attached to; the registry, so what is the claim being made about that person; assessment and evaluation, so how has this been verified and by whom; and then the storage, maintenance and recall of that credential, so basically a database, a transactional database of some sort. And a credential has both institutional and technical properties, and Ellie was speaking to this earlier, so trust and transparency is kind of built in, security and auditability, and transactional value and use. And that bit is particularly interesting, and I'll get to that. So we know that identity is made up of many things and it changes over time. And we also know that economic participation or involvement in labour markets, which is how the world currently operates, is dependent upon proof of identity, experience and skills or credentials. And to date, skills, qualifications or credentials have been very formal. They've been issued by learning institutions as a value exchange for money. So I paid to do my course at RMIT and I got a piece of paper saying that I did that course and I passed it, and then I can use that to prove to a potential employer that I have that credential. What digital credentials and digital technologies are enabling is a more democratic and low cost option for credentialing, which has previously not been available. So that gives us the opportunity to start to think broader than formal qualifications for how someone's skills and experience is represented. And we can start to think of how someone's citizenship, just going about their normal life, social and economic participation can be represented to create an identity picture that is meaningful and credible to others, which is what identity is, right? It's not just about who I am, it's proving who I am and my trustworthiness. And so this is what Mardi was speaking about earlier, that sort of pulling together a confident picture of who someone is, or their life bio, as she explained last week to me, which I fell in love with. So, for example, using the justice system example, if I know that at Red Cross in Western Australia, there's a team of volunteers helping people exiting the Boronia Women's Prison to get work ready. So they're getting ready to go out into the workforce. And what if they got a credential to prove that they'd been through that program and how that could help them gain employment? Or if a migrant who wants to get permanent residency in Australia and they've been volunteering at Oz Harvest every week, giving out food to people who need it, then they could get an attestation from a volunteering manager to prove that they've done that work and use that as part of their evidence to become a permanent resident in Australia. So this sort of opportunity is to create a more visible and granular system to recognise experience and skills, and that may be a part of the answer to digital identity equity.
Thanks, Amelia. I love that concept of democratization, and I think that's fundamental to the power, as you said, of digital or verifiable digital credentials, particularly for people who might be experiencing vulnerability at a certain point in their life. I think it's hugely powerful. Can you talk a little bit more about Traverse and the product itself and what it actually does and how it helps provide those verifiable digital credentials?
Sure. When I first started, I swung between this is incredibly simple to this is incredibly complicated every couple of days. So let's start with the simple. So Traverse will allow organisations to issue, verify and revoke credentials. So it's a very simple screen where you just issue a credential, and users can then claim that credential into a digital wallet that they then own, and they can choose who to share that credential with, and they share what information they want to with others. And how that works in practice, we're piloting credentials, different types of credentials with organisations such as Red Cross, Care Australia, Oxfam and others through the Trust Alliance, which Katy will speak to soon. So at its core, it's a very simple idea, and others are doing it, particularly in the education space. We're looking at it from a broader society sort of perspective and how we can help people experiencing vulnerability. And we're using a humanity first principle to really challenge ourselves to create a product that is not only commercially viable, and we do want that too, but that is inclusive and good for humanity. And so I've spent 20 years commercialising digital products, and I can tell you the last 3 months I've had more mind-bending conversations than I've had in my whole career by putting humanity first. It's not as easy as it sounds. Yesterday I was like down here like, oh God. So yeah, it's not that easy.
So what are some of the examples? What are some of the things that you're grappling with when you're trying to balance the sort of, you know, how do we take a commercial product to market whilst at the same time ensure that, you know, humans are protected and their privacy is safeguarded, amongst other things?
Yeah, so as Ellie mentioned, developing on blockchain has some really great potential. There's real opportunity for decentralized technology to offer solutions in digital identity. However, we live in a Web 2.0 world, and there's user experience standards and expectations that exist, and particularly with people experiencing vulnerability or volunteers who we're looking at as our first sector. Many volunteers are over 65 and they bought their phone from Coles, and we have no idea, like that's not a common thing to develop for. So there's this real tension between Web3 standards and normal people in their normal life trying to use it. So for example, sharing credentials is integral to an identity ecosystem. It's no good if you've just got it. And a decentralized tool means that it has really long URLs. That's just how it's been built. That's how the nerds have designed it. It's literally like this long in an email. And as we were running pilots, the enterprise email systems like Outlook were just chomping those URLs up and rendering them useless. And there was nothing we could do about that, because that's security protection from Outlook. It's stuffing up our very safe URLs. So if we used a link shortener, which would solve that problem, we suddenly have a centralized database with a short link saying this is the long link, and then we've lost our decentralization value proposition because we've got that central spot now. So that's problematic and something that was making me cry the other day in my chair. And then on the customer side, so if we're selling a credentialing tool to customers like Red Cross to issue credentials, the volunteer managers we've been speaking to get super excited because they're like, oh great, I'll be able to track all my volunteers and where they're at with their training and their credentials. And then when I need someone who has this skill, I can go and find them. And then I'm there saying, well, not really, because it's decentralized and we don't have a big honeypot of data that you can use. And it you can see them going, that sounds good, but is that useful? Like, it's this real sort of conundrum for us and for me as a product manager who would love that honeypot of data to build new products that have like prediction in them or insights and like lots of stuff that I would usually do in a Web 2.0 world. So they're just a couple of examples of the challenges that we're facing, but they're essential to solve if we're going to get this marketplace vortex spinning.
Absolutely. And what was going through my mind is you're talking about a real paradigm shift on a number of different levels, certainly from a business model perspective. So good that you're out there fighting the fight, Amelia, and make it a lot easier for all of us coming behind you. So what else is needed to get a credential marketplace working?
I think the other key element to solve for is standards. So as mentioned earlier, credentials are only useful if there's transactional value in them for someone. And if you have a wallet full of credentials that mean nothing to anyone else, then there's no value or utility in that credential. So standards for credentials attempt to enhance ubiquity and interoperability, transparency, confidence, as Mardi was saying, and authenticity. And we can solve for some of that using technical standards, which we are doing. But confidence and authenticity is a people problem. And that takes a lot longer to solve than a technical problem. Technology is easy. It's getting organizations to come together and say, hey, let's talk standards. Like if we're talking to Mardi, what are you going to accept if someone comes to your door with a bunch of credentials that they've got from social workers? What does that mean? How is that a bridge into your system so that they can get on with their lives? So we're sort of at the start of this sort of social credentialing ecosystem. And I think at first we'll rely on existing conventions to begin with. So for example, a verifiable credential issued by the Red Cross to say I've done first aid training, that's likely to have some utility just due to the brand name, due to the understanding of what that credential is. But over time, we want to ensure that utility and portability of credentials it is more than just relying on the organisation's trust, like Ellie was saying. So that's why we're working with the Trust Alliance. We're a member of the Trust Alliance to tackle the people part of the problem and work with organisations to start agreeing what those standards are.
Great. Thanks, Amelia. Fantastic and fascinating insights, and good luck. Katy, that's probably a great opportunity to bring you into the conversation because as Amelia alluded to, identity equity is not something that can be developed in isolation. It truly does require a village. So why do we need a useful and ethical digital identity ecosystem?
Thanks, Amanda. Wow, what an amazing set of introductions. I hope I can follow up and do them justice. Just kind of looping back to the theme of this wonderful event, which is chipping away at the big challenges. I'm just going to start with something that is a bit extreme, but relates to my kind of personal experience, and I think demonstrates why we are focusing on building an ecosystem that for utility, but you know, very much aligned around humanity first values and principles as our priority. So my first job in the humanitarian sector was responding to the Rwandan crisis, the genocide, in 1994, when during 100 days of killing 800,000 Tutsis, largely Tutsis and Hutu supporters were killed. The reason that was possible was because ethnicity was included on their ID cards. And that's why it happened so quickly and at that scale. So I've kind of carried that through my career, and it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about humanity first approaches to digital identity. At the same time, as Amanda said, we know that 1.1 billion people are excluded from services protections because they can't prove who they are. And that, the digital identity solutions have been largely centralized, proprietary, monopoly-based solutions. So the Trust Alliance is Obviously not going to solve all of that quickly. Let me just put that out there. But what it is, I mean, we were started in 2019, so we're relatively new. It's a collaboration of for-purpose research and technology organisations with a mission to lead the emergence of an ethical and useful digital identity ecosystem. It was formed because focused around addressing a very kind of real problem that needed a practical solution that was initially surfaced and supported by the Australian Red Cross. And that was around how can volunteers who work for different organisations in Australia more effectively share their credentials with different organisations, both in terms of their utility and portability, but also making sure that the volunteers were able to choose who, when and how they shared their credentials. The solution, as Amelia has talked about, and Ellie as well, was enabled through blockchain technology that in so many ways aligns with the core kind of values and principles that bind together these very diverse organisations that have come together as this ecosystem. So decentralised, open ecosystem, user in control, yeah, very much putting humans in control and at the centre of what we do. Following on from that, I think there was a realisation that this kind of emerging alliance, you know, had real potential, that that creating this kind of infrastructure of trust, and I'm looking at Ellie when I say this, this infrastructure of trust that was enabled through the innate trust from blockchain technology, but it was actually based on trust standards between organizations and humans, and built on existing relationships. That could be used for many different purposes to address all kinds of issues in the digital identity landscape, primarily fragmentation, but also by bringing together such a diverse bunch of organisations with different expertise. So, you know, we have Ellie and RMIT and her perspective in the Blockchain Innovation Hub. Then we, you know, have Services Australia and their alternative identity pathways. We have Traverse, which is, you know, giving us, surfacing the lessons by, you know, piloting and applying things in practice. And as a result, we have started to kind of seed and surface a whole range of alternative use cases and solutions, including some really complex ones facing the humanitarian sector around how do we prevent the recycling of humanitarian workers who've committed misconduct, you know, as a result of a fragmented system. So, you know, those solutions can only be found through collective action, through us working collectively, both to turn standards, you know, into reality, to share and issue credentials, to figure out ways to harness this nascent technology to ensure that we don't become another monopoly, that we really live our values and decentralize and become an open ecosystem. I'll be quiet now. There's so much I could talk about, but this is a bit of a taster.
Thanks, Katy. You talked about the ecosystem development, and again, it's sort of, you know, it's emerging and growing. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, you know, how do you bring this ecosystem together? What are we learning about the ecosystem development as you're sort of going through the process?
We're learning that it's incredibly difficult, but that's the whole point. You know, the whole idea is that we do have diverse interests and expertise, and actually, you know, have those difficult conversations, challenging discussions, iterate as we go. I think there is an inherent paradox that we're really grappling with, and Ellie will nod her head at this one, which is how do we grow an open ecosystem whilst at the same time ensuring that the most vulnerable are protected from bad actors, but also understanding that it only takes one bad actor to implode the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so there's an inherent tension there, and we certainly don't have all the answers, and we have many interesting and robust discussions about it. But I think the most important piece is that as a collective, we are all committed to the open ecosystem, and sort of bringing it's a daisy wheel, the Trust Alliance. We're focused on the collaboration, on the shared standards, on harnessing our collective expertise. But, you know, behind us are organisations. And so part of our role as an alliance is to bring those organisations along with us. And sometimes that means pushing those, you know, our organisations out of their comfort zone, making them think about risk in different ways, making them work in different ways. And so, yeah, that's the sort of beauty of it, but also the challenge.
Thanks, Katy. Rachel and the team, I'm conscious of time. Did you want to open up to questions for the group?
Yeah, no, this has been such a wonderful conversation to eavesdrop on, Amanda. And I suppose I just think this whole humanity first approach to digital identity is just, yeah, it's just really, really nourishing. I think I'm trying to think of a word, but it really is really, really interesting. Can I suggest people on the line, if you've got questions? I know there's been a few comments there actually on the chat. And Michael, I might get you if you want to come on. In the meantime, can I just suggest, you know, for people listening, and of course we're recording this, so we'll be sending it out, Amanda. It might be good if we could just get each of the contributors just to tell us, you know, how do we further this along? Because it's such a big challenge, and you've talked about it, you know, requiring a village. But for those that are hearing almost digital equity or identity equity, sorry, for the first time, you know, what do you all need to make this a reality?
I'll go first.
Go for it.
The person trying to build the commercial product goes first. I'm really interested in finding use cases where people are open to exploring a pilot on what a credential could look like in their organisation with volunteers they may have, where people experiencing vulnerability. And there's so many use cases that we could start with. So I'm interested in finding some and seeing if we could help anyone get started with that journey.
I'll go second. From the Trust Alliance perspective, we're interested in growing the ecosystem. So organisations who are values aligned and want to get involved, very, very keen to hear from you. We have a membership scheme for both organisations and also for collaborators, i.e. individuals who have value to add and are interested in getting involved as advisors or contributors. So very keen to hear from anyone who wants to become involved.
I guess I'll go next. For me, it's about trying to influence a standard. So we talk about different organisations and what their requirements are from accepting an identity, and from my experience, a lot of those standards are related to, I guess, a risk appetite, depending on the service or what they're offering the person. So from a government perspective, we'd like to really use the the real life use cases to influence what a national standard might look like, so that it isn't, technology doesn't go forward with, a one approach. It needs to address a bigger cohort of people. So it's really about having these conversations, influencing government more broadly, to communicate, educate around what a good standard looks like, as opposed to everybody make your own rules up, because I think that's where the web of identity has just become so complex. We rely on other people's credentials. Example, a driver's license. It was never issued initially by means to be an identity credential, but just evidence that you've passed your test to drive. And the standard to actually get that document is seen as relatively low in some aspects, but then you can go and use that document to create other documents out in the community. So it all comes down to standards to support that person's identity information as well. So yeah, that's a fairly important piece from my perspective.
Can I just flag, I've just seen Kerry Farrance in the chat. Hi, Kerry. Who I know. She's
I was going to, sorry, does Kerry want to come on and ask her question? Maybe she is there.
I can. I quite enjoy just being de-identified in Zoom meetings at the moment. So I will. Hi, thank you everyone. Really interesting conversation, and I know it's not really the purpose of what we were talking today, but listening particularly to Traverse, and I know Katy and some of the work that she has done with other sort of similar projects. I'm interested to see, whilst the identity is obviously the key purpose around Traverse, do you see that you could adapt that system to actually be able to, I guess, provide that greater access into other areas and other services? So I guess more specifically, really interested to know whether you are looking at how that system could be used to support someone who needs to purchase or access food relief, and access into a more purchasing or payment system as well. And I think in some cases, some of the people that we're talking about are probably grappling with both the identity challenge as well as, being able to access a payment system so that they can actually purchase goods and services that they need to access. So, yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Interesting, Kerry, because blockchain kind of offers both use cases, right? I think Traverse is going to focus on identity, and we'll do that for a while, hopefully get it right. Like, it's a long path, I think, ahead for us to really influence and get it right in terms of identity. But there are members of the Trust Alliance who are looking at payments. Sempo, for example, Katy, and the Oxfam one. What's that one, Katy?
Unblock Cash. Yeah, I've already connected Kerry with Sempo. I think Give Where You Live should just join the Trust Alliance, and then we can build out a solution. Maybe
we will go down that. We'll talk, Katy.
Just to add in there that I think, at the end of it, identity is actually still the sort of common denominator, because you need to know who somebody is in order to be able to transfer them cash or to provide aid. So however we determine that identity, we still need to know who someone is to enough confidence level to, again, to borrow Mardi's language, that we feel confident enough. And the example I would give, again, with Red Cross in the recent bushfire, before the last crisis that we had. The crisis before that was bushfires. And as you will know, as a organisation that supports people recovering from bushfires, we were tasked with handing over a large amount of money to people quickly. And one of the key challenges is actually understanding who those people are so that we can give them that money and that it doesn't get, we don't get scammed and it ends up going to all sorts of nefarious places. But I think at the end of the day, identity is still the common denominator. And being able to establish someone's identity quickly with enough confidence that we can then, as you said, Kerry, enable them to participate through, accessing services, whether that's cash or aid, I think is really, really critical.
And I guess one of the things that I think resonates, again, around this kind of whole values and principle approaches, the way that we're looking at this is also around how do we actually democratise the food relief space, and actually how do we give users in that system the choice and access to just go where they need to go, rather than forcing them to go to one provider in our region.
I think that's a really key point, and why the Trust Alliance is quite important, because otherwise, even if you're using blockchain applications for these voucher programs, it can still lock people into a particular app, which is not necessarily enabling what you're talking about. The other thing that's been quite interesting in this area is just with COVID is governments trying to administer emergency payments, and as a result, really intensifying their research and trials into central bank digital currencies, because they can see that there are clear efficiencies and ways of getting help to people far more quickly than using these very old, outdated social security systems or whatever it might be to be able to identify
a paper voucher, basically.
But they're coming up against the same issues, which I don't think government will necessarily be able to address, which is privacy, because maybe it's fine for a one-off emergency payment, but to have central bank digital currencies that are used on a regular basis, and I think the Australian government in particular is being quite cautious on this front, it means that it's much easier for them to potentially track all of our payments. And in the States, emergency COVID payments, some of them were administered by Square and Visa and like electronic payment providers, because they just didn't have ways of getting money to people. So I do think that there is a really big picture, I think, to what the Trust Alliance and Traverse and Sempo and others are doing, which is around systems that are that enable the kind of coordination you're talking about, but do so in ways which are still enabling people to have privacy.
There was just a question that was sent to me, and I just thought I don't think they want to come on the line. So I think this was coming back to something Marty shared earlier, but in terms of learnings from other countries, particularly Pacific Rim, and I suppose I think they're sort of wanting to understand what learnings you're working with there. Marty, do you want to take that up first? Are you learning from other countries?
Look, certainly in the broader work across government in identity, there've been particularly digital identity. There's been many and varied forums to explore how other countries are using, creating digital identities. I think, in a welfare setting, it comes back to what we're talking about today, that humanity first. We've got different privacy principles compared to some of the other countries, different risk appetites depending on the service that's being offered for that identity. So there's definitely, not within my particular section, but there's been learnings from other countries such as UK, where they've implemented digital identities and by or adopted by citizens. and hopefully tied into some lessons learned and applied in the way that you know, the Australian government might approach that. For us, it's about focusing on the Australian community and what's unique to those individuals. Yeah.
Katy, you've got some interesting perspectives. Oh, you've come up, you beat me to it. Go.
I mean, I just from the Trust Alliance, you know, perspective, you know, one of the, you know, the kind of innate value of the Alliance really is that it's both, it's made up of an ecosystem of both like domestic and global actors. And so, you know, so we have, you know, a big range of international development humanitarian organisations, you know, the Red Cross obviously being one of them, who, you know, what we're able to do is to both draw on the kind of expertise and everything that's happening with those organisations and pull that into the Trust Alliance. But also I think fundamentally, you know, what it does is it really enables us to kind of live our values around equity, lived experience, you know, addressing some of those power dynamics, because as organisations we work in partnership, and we are very much working towards making sure that, you know, our partners are the ones who are making the decisions and have agency and voice in the solutions that are being developed. So that's the intent behind the Trust Alliance.
And also, Katy, you mentioned before to me talking about sort of collective identities versus individual identities. So again, this sort of notion of identity is very different in different contexts and countries. And so just being sort of cognizant of that as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and I mean, it speaks to some of the pieces that Mardi's been talking about today, which is, you know, really questioning notions of identity and understanding that, you know, in many contexts, identity is collective, not individual, and that, you know, identity is not static, and it's very much kind of placed within context and culture. And so making sure that, you know, for me, equity is about making sure that lived experience is driving our solutions and our discussions, and you know, not sort of, it's not about a top-down approach, and it's very much about understanding power. So when we talk about identity, you know, and we talk about user in control, I'm always so mindful of the fact that you know, user in control implies that the user is therefore in a position of power, but actually we always, you know, need to remember that, you know, it's whoever is requesting proof of identity who ultimately has the power, and that may be a humanitarian worker, and we mustn't assume that all humanitarian workers are motivated or driven by the same values. Anyway, we won't go into that wormhole, but those are some of the discussions that we have in the Trust Alliance. So if you want to hear more, come and join us. That's Wonderful. My last plug.
Can I just, there's been a question in the chat from Wayne. Ellie, I think this one might be for you, because, I mean, of course, credentialing is working, you know, in organisations, and Wayne makes a point about hospitals. And I suppose this is where it gets interesting in terms of the challenges you find when, and what you're talking about in these settings that we've been sharing, and in something like that, and why is the blockchain needed? So can you perhaps explain to people about that?
Look, I think Wayne's right. It's not necessary to have blockchain for every particular situation. And the example that he's given there, yeah, I tend to agree that the security standards are probably working quite well in that particular process. I think that I think it is, in the examples that we're talking about, it is a bigger network problem. And, you know, I think Kerry's example before, it kind of illustrates it really, which is that someone needs assistance, but they might not have any choice about where to go for that assistance because only one particular agency has identified them and knows who they are. But if they can take their Traverse wallet that, you know, Red Cross has said, I'm such and such, and they can take that to Save the Children, because that's who they need assistance from at that point in time. And Save the Children can go, oh yeah, Red Cross has said that this person is who they are, therefore I can trust that and provide them with assistance immediately. I mean, that's a really powerful thing. And, you know, it's not just a situation where it's about trusting that credential. It's about bigger issues of being able to move around the world. But it's definitely also a conversation that we're having, of course, in the education sector at various levels, in relation to how do we do digital credentials. We currently, you know, use plenty of digital credential service providers who may use some form of blockchain or not, but it can still be proprietary and not open. And although it makes it easy for me to be able to download my particular certificate or degree or whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of an ecosystem where it's easy to share that or be accepted by others.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ellie. Look, in the interest of time, we could keep talking because this is actually such a dense topic, isn't it? And the more you talk, more you want to find out. So I know people do need to jump off. Can I suggest that we will thank the contributors now? And if people do want to stay around and just have a bit more of a chat, I've just been asked again privately for someone to ask a question. I'm going to thank all of our contributors. Caroline will stop recording now, and then we can have a more informal chat for those people that want to stay on the line. Thank you all very much for joining what has been an insightful discussion around identity equity, and thank you to our contributors.